Welcome, everybody. So good to see all of you here. And we have the honor today to listen to our dear Andy, who is a scientist by trade, but a historian as family and personal passion. And Andy was born just a little bit ago in Greece, actually, in Athens. And I heard already a lot about his story, and I'm always passionate and curious to hear a little bit more of his personal story and also how it ties to his family history and how he came to this country and what happened in Greece before that, both in his time and before his time, as he is keeping and sharing a little bit of his family history as well. So without further ado, please, Andy, share with us a little bit of all this amazing wisdom and history so we can honor also the life of Jews in Greece in the past and here in the present as well.
Well, thank you very much, Rav Natan. Thank you all who joined this evening. I really appreciate it. I'm especially grateful to the congregation for its invitation to give this lecture. And I must say that, all the years that I've been a member of Congregation Etz Chaim, it's been a wonderfully warm, welcoming, inclusive congregation in which I've greatly enjoyed the spiritual services, the inspiring sermons, the great wealth of educational programs, and the dedicated outreach and social action activities. So today, the lecture that we will listen to and discuss is, of course, in commemoration of Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Memorial Day, and it is specifically about the story of Greek Jewry and the Holocaust. So I'm going to share my screen for a PowerPoint presentation, and we'll get started. Lecture should take about 45 minutes to 50 at most, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So I hope everybody can see the screen. Yes? All right, very good. So Jews have lived in Greece from the earliest days of the diaspora. In fact, the Greek Jewish community is the oldest in Europe. First evidence of Jews in Greece dates back to the 6th century before the Common Era. Most communities actually grew during the Hellenistic times. And here is a map where every city that you see here actually had a Hellenized Jewish community dating to the 1st century before the Common Era. There is evidence here of a synagogue near Athens in Aegina. How do we know it was a synagogue? Well, it's a mosaic and it says so right here. In fact, the word synagogue comes from two Greek words which mean coming together or a place of gathering. And that word is, of course, now used to denote the place of worship of the Jewish people in most languages of the world. And I'm not talking only about Western languages, but even languages such as Russian, Turkish, Japanese, and so on. Here are some remnants of a synagogue in Corinth, which had a large Jewish population. Here is one from Athens, and this is actually fascinating because it is right from the Agora of Athens. The Agora was the central marketplace directly underneath the Acropolis. That's the place not only where people came to do their shopping, but actually where politicians and orators came and gave their speeches. There was a Jewish synagogue there, and in fact, there was a Jewish community. Jews lived in that area preferentially for 2,000 years, even up to the Second World War. In fact, even today, the Synagogue of Athens is located maybe a 7-minute walk from that area. So who are the Jews who lived in Greece from those old days? Well, they're called Romaniots. They're indigenous Greek Jews. They, of course, predated the Sephardim, predated the Ashkenazim. They were Greek, like every other Greek person. They were fully assimilated, but they differed in terms of their religion and their language. So they spoke Greek like all Greeks, but used Hebrew, of course, for the Jewish services. They also differed in the types of Torahs that they used, and they still do. So the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, which we use, of course, in reading scripture, or for us, among Ashkenazi Jews, as you know, the cylinders are wrapped in a cloth cover, but for the Greek indigenous Jews, and then later for some Sephardic communities, they were encased in a wooden enclosure. And the other difference was that rather than putting the Torah on the table and reading it flat, actually the Torah was read like you see here. It was read vertically, just the way you see it here. All right, so those ancient Greek communities were, to a large extent, absorbed when the Sephardi Jews arrived, starting in 1492. That was the time when Ferdinand and Isabella, the royal couple in Spain, evicted the Jews who did not convert. And there were many tens of thousands of Jews who left not only Spain and later Portugal, but in time other Catholic countries and even places north of the Mediterranean, which were Ashkenazi. So we had large influx of Sephardic Jews from Mediterranean countries to what was then the Ottoman Empire, which was a welcoming haven for Jews at that time, also some from Ashkenazi areas, and most of them converged to Salonika. Salonika was a large port in the Aegean Sea, and with the arrival of the Jews, after something like 50 years, it became the major commercial port of the Ottoman Empire for a number of centuries. So here in green and light green, you see the extent of the Ottoman Empire at its largest, at the largest extent. And you notice that Salonika is really at the center of it. It was the major commercial city for the Ottoman Empire. It was also the major port in the Balkans, and there was commerce coming to it as far away as Central Europe. The port was essentially a Jewish operation. It was so Jewish that it closed on Saturday, on the Sabbath, all the way up to the First World War. But the Jews were active in many, many other professions and many other trades. And the economy of Salonika, to a very large extent, depended on the Jews. Over time, the Jews became the actual majority of the population. There were more than 50% of the population during the 17th through 19th century, and then were followed by Greeks, Turks, Bulgarians, and Serbs. Among the many books that have been written about Salonika, I would say the one that I thought is the best is this one, by Mark Mazauer. He's a professor of history at Columbia University, and this book details in a very, very graphic and understandable and enjoyable way the history of Salonika under Christian, Muslim, and Jewish times for the last 500 years. So Salonika became a center of Sephardic Jewry. It was called among the Sephardim the Jerusalem of the Balkans and Mother of Israel. But it was not just a commercial center, it was also a religious center. Many famous rabbis whose Talmudic responsa we can access even today lived and acted in Salonika. It was also a center of Kabbalah. Many famous poets, most famous one being Shlomo Alkabetz, whose Sabbath hymn Lecha Dodi actually inaugurates our Sabbath worship every Friday evening. One of the earliest printing presses in the world was a Jewish printing press, the Sonsino press, which I'm sure is familiar to many people, still exists today with branches all over, and a major one was in Salonika. Here is an early postcard from, about 110 years ago of Rabbi Jacob Meir. This is written in French. Here it says, His Excellency, the Grand Rabbi Jacob Meir of Salonika, Turkey. Because at that time, Salonika was still part of the Ottoman Empire when he was chief rabbi in 1908 to 1919. And then 2 years later, he became the first Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel at that time under the British mandate in Palestine. But Salonika was home not only for famous rabbis, but also for rather infamous people, the most notorious one being Shabbatai Tzvi, the most infamous of the pseudo-messiahs who appeared occasionally. He was born in Smyrna, today Izmir, in Turkey. He moved to Salonika because that's where the largest density of Jews were, and he was able to convince tens of thousands of followers that he was the Messiah. In fact, so many that the Sultan got really worried, had him arrested, told him he'd be executed unless he converted to Islam, which he very promptly did, and most of his followers did the same. All right, so here are some examples of the daily newspapers in Jewish Salonika. They were printed in Ladino, the Spanish Hebrew mix that was used by Sephardic Jews and still is. There were daily newspapers like these two. There even was a satirical newspaper. There was a newspaper in French, because French was the language of the educated people. It was the international language, like English is today. But there are also examples of religious books, like this one for the high holidays, printed in Salonika almost 100 years ago. Here's a beautiful marriage certificate, a ketubah, from about 180 years ago. So Salonika benefited a lot from the presence of Jews, not only during the time when they were active, during commerce and other economic activities, but even today, from the architecture and what they left behind. Here, for example, is one of the houses of a very rich Jewish family, the Alatini family. This is the Villa Alatini from a photograph of more than 100 years ago. Today, this building is used as the Central Macedonia government office. Here is the residence of the Mordoch family, Villa Mordoch. Now it's the National Gallery in Salonika. There was a famous Jewish hospital built in 1907 by Baron Hirsch, so the Hirsch Jewish Hospital. Now this is the administrative building of the Hippocrates Municipal Hospital of Thessaloniki. This is a fascinating picture. This is the former Jewish cemetery of Thessaloniki or Salonika. That cemetery started in 1493, so the year right after the first refugees arrived in Salonika. Just look at the graves, how densely they are packed right next to each other in a totally irregular pattern. Practically every space, every nook and cranny is filled. Why? Because everybody over the 5 centuries from 1493 till the Holocaust is buried there. There were something like 500,000 graves in that cemetery. In fact, it was not called a cemetery, it was called a necropolis, a city of the dead. Its area was about 0.4 miles by 0.4 miles, really an enormous area. Well, that cemetery was totally razed by the Nazis in 1942. It was destroyed with the support of the, local Greek authorities at that time who were very, very eager to have the area developed. And in fact, today, what rests on what used to be the graves of the Salonika Jews is the entire campus of the University of Thessaloniki. So that was a brief history of Salonika and the early Jewish communities. So now I'd like to transition to how the Second World War involved Greece and how that, of course, led to the Holocaust itself. Well, Second World War started in Greece not through an invasion by the Nazis or Hitler, but actually by an invasion of the Italians, the Italian fascists under Mussolini. Mussolini craved to do what Hitler was doing at that time in 1940. Hitler had, of course, conquered Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, even France. And his ally Mussolini wanted to build his own empire. So he conquered Albania, came south from Albania into Greece, but the Greek forces were able to repel the Italian ones, push back into Albania, deeply into Albania, and start advancing north toward Italy. So Hitler got really worried about what was happening, and even though he had no plans to invade Greece, he came to the aid of Italy, and the Nazi forces came down through Bulgaria, which was an ally of the Nazis. Once again, the Greek forces resisted valiantly, and it took the Nazi armies something like 2 months from April to June to conquer Greece. That actually turned out to be a catalytic event in the outcome of the Second World War. Why? Because Hitler at that time was planning to invade Russia, and he got delayed by 2 months from doing so. As a result, by the time Nazi forces reached the outskirts of Moscow, it was already deep in the heart of winter. They were not able to capture Moscow. The Russians then repelled them, and that was the turning point of the Second World War. Here are some quotes from people about what happened at that time. Here is something from Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States at that time. Here is a quote from someone even more closely associated with the events. Adolf Hitler at the Reichstag, he praised the heroism, the courage of the Greek soldiers. But the one quote that I really want to read to you comes from Field Marshal Keitel. He was the chief of staff of all the German armed forces, and that's what he said at his trial in Nuremberg in 1946. The unbelievably strong resistance of the Greeks delayed by 2 or more vital months the German attack against Russia. If we did not have this long delay, the outcome of the war would have been different in the Eastern Front and the war in general, and others would have been accused and occupying this seat as defendants today. So that's a brief history of how the Second World War affected Greece, but what did the Jews have to do with it? Well, actually quite a bit. This is the first senior Greek army officer who was killed in the fight against the Italians. He was a Jew, Colonel Mordechai Frizis. He's quite famous in Greece. He not only was killed in battle, he was actually leading the Greek troops inside Albania, personally leading them. He also had contributed to the drafting of the defense plans of Greece, which were so successful. Today, there are a number of statues of Colonel Mordechai Frizis in Greece, and overall, there were something like 13,000 Greek Jews who served in the Second World War, and more than 500 were killed in action. All right, so that was the Greek resistance against the Italians and the Nazis, but the outcome, of course, we know what happened. Greece was occupied, and there came this famous photograph that showed the raising of the Nazi flag on the Acropolis right in front of the Parthenon. So Greece was occupied now by the Axis forces, by Germany, Italy, and Bulgaria. And it is very interesting to see how Greece was divided among these three occupying powers. So here to the left, you see the map of Greece as it was before the Nazi invasion. And here to the right is how Greece was divided by those forces. So very interestingly, the Germans did not want to occupy themselves with taking care of, of Greece. They just wanted the border areas right here with Turkey, the islands neighboring Turkey, part of Crete, which was the southernmost part of Europe and close to the African theater of war, with Rommel there fighting the British. And they left the biggest part of Greece, all of mainland Greece, to the Italians. In addition to that, they gave Eastern Macedonia and Thrace to the Bulgarians, which Bulgaria was claiming for a while. And that actually ended up being tragic for the Jews in that area. Now, to this day, Bulgaria claims that they protected their own Jews during the Second World War. That is only partly correct. They protected their own Jews in Bulgaria, but the Jews in the occupied part of Greece by Bulgaria, they rounded them up, sent them to Treblinka, and 98% of the Jews in this part occupied by Bulgaria perished. There are no longer any Jewish communities there at all. Now, tragically for Salonika, which was the biggest community, Jewish community in Greece, that was one part that the Germans kept under control directly from the beginning, so Central Macedonia. And so the fate of the Jews in Salonika, which were 60,000 people, the largest community in Greece, was unfortunately written very early on. So this is how the Holocaust took place in Salonika. It started in 1942 in the usual way, as we've learned from other countries. The Nazis forced the Jews to have special identity cards and, of course, to wear the Jewish star. Over time, Jewish men were taken to slave labor to build railroad tracks through mountains. Only later would we realize what those railroad tracks really were used for, namely to bring the poor victims to Auschwitz. Jewish properties were totally expropriated. Jews were forced away from their homes, gave up their shops, gave up all their possessions, and were all forced to live in two ghettos that were created around the commercial railroad station. And then, starting in March of 1943, the deportations started. It took something like 16 separate train deportations to take all the Salonika Jews to Auschwitz. 56,000 Jews from Salonika were deported to Auschwitz. You can imagine why it took so long. Not only were the numbers great, but also the distance from Greece to Auschwitz was actually the longest trip among all the areas occupied by the Nazis in Europe. Those poor victims had to stay in the cattle trains for 13 to 14 days. By the time they arrived in Auschwitz, most of them were dead. The ones who were not dead were emaciated, and therefore a very large fraction of them were sent directly to the gas chambers. There is a plaque here at that old railroad station. This is an actual photograph of the Jews being put into those cattle cars, and there is a plaque commemorating what happened to them. And that tragically was the end of this enormous and famous historical community of Salonika. As I mentioned before, 96% of its Jews perished. Fewer than 1,000 were able to return, and the community has really dwindled away. All right, that was the story in Salonika. Now, what was happening in the rest of Greece at that time? Well, as soon as the first measures against the Jews were taken, the Archbishop of Athens and all Greece issued a very strong protest to the Nazis and to the Greek collaborating authorities, begging them to leave the Jews alone, and moreover threatening them about what would happen in the future if things do change. It was an extremely strong letter, but what is most impressive is that he got the heads of all major educational, cultural, professional organizations to sign it. Here you see the presidents of the academy, of the universities, presidents of the lawyers' associations, notaries, medical association, authors, journalists, pharmacists, chemists, actors, and on and on and on. They all signed it together in this protest. Archbishop Damaskinos was a real hero, someone who was known internationally. You see him here on the cover of Time magazine at that time. He became even more famous at the end of the German occupation in late 1944, because he was named regent of Greece for something like 2 years. You see, Greece before the war used to be a monarchy, had a king, and after the Germans left Greece, there was lots of political infighting, civil war, and it took 2 years for the population finally and the politicians to decide whether they would bring back the king or change into a presidential parliamentary republic. And so it was Archbishop Damaskinos who was named the regent of Greece, and you see him here with Winston Churchill, who was visiting Greece at that time. Here is a statue of Archbishop Damaskinos in one of the central squares of Athens. Well, all right. So now let us move from the Holocaust in Salonika to the Holocaust in Athens, which was a very different story for a number of reasons. First of all, the Jews in Athens were far, far fewer than in Salonika. Salonika had almost 60,000 Jews. Athens at that time had fewer than 5,000. Secondly, the Holocaust there took place significantly later. And why? Because remember, that part of the country was controlled by the Italians. And the Italians not only protected the Jews fully, but Italians in general behaved very, very humanely toward the Greeks and generally the occupied country. But something happened in September of 1943 that I think we're all familiar with. The Allies invaded Italy through Sicily, drove north, eventually captured Rome, and on September 8th, Italy capitulated to the Allies. So that set up a course of events in Greece in something like just a few days. And I'm going to show you the full chronology here, because it really was the center of what ended up affecting all the Jews in Greece, in Athens, sorry. So on 8th of September, Italy capitulates to the Allies. 2 days later, the German forces take over the entire Italian zone of occupation of Greece. That was September 10th. Only 10 days later, Eichmann sends his deputy, his number 2, Dieter Wischlitzeny, to Athens to implement the final solution there. This is Wischlitzeny. He was a horrible war criminal, not only in Greece, but in other countries, Poland in particular. He was convicted after the war in Nuremberg and hanged. So he arrives on September 20th, and look what happens the next day. The very next day, Vishlitzeni summons the rabbi of Athens, Elias Barzilai, and gives him 1 day to produce the list of all Athens Jews. I'll tell you in a minute what Barzilai did, but first let me say something about him. So Elias Barzilai was the rabbi of Athens from the 1930s through the 1960s. He survived. He was the rabbi that I knew, the first rabbi, my rabbi in Athens. From age 2 through my bar mitzvah, he was the rabbi. I remember as a small child when we went to the synagogue on Friday evening, at the end of the services, all the little children, including me, lined up in front of him to kiss his hands and get his blessing. So I remember him very well. So Barzilai was a hero. Instead of producing the records of Athens Jews, as Vishlitzeni asked, he went immediately back to the community, convened a meeting of all the leaders who warned the Jews. And the Jews were warned to run away, escape, hide. The end is coming. At the same time, he invited young leaders, young activists who were there, and they burned the list, destroyed the lists. And one of those activists at that time was my father. He was 30 years old. So look what happened on the next day, September 22. Barzilai goes back to Vishlitzeni, tells him no records could be found. The list had been destroyed earlier. That's what he said. And he asked for 48 hours to reconstitute the list. Vishlitzeni has no choice. He needs the list of the Jews. So he gives 48 hours to Rabbi Barzilai. At that point, Barzilai goes and visits the Archbishop, the Maskinos, and Greek political leaders and leaders of the Greek police to solicit help. At the same time, the young community activists get in touch with the Greek partisans, the Greek resistance up on the mountains to shelter the rabbi and his family up on the mountains. So September 22nd was a very busy and active and fateful day. I will show you in 1 minute what else happened on September 22nd, but let me first complete that story. So in the night of the next day, 23rd to 24th of September, the rabbi and his family are indeed taken by the partisans to the mountains. Vishlitzeni waits for his appearance, doesn't see him. He comes to the community offices, breaks in, finds nothing. So I will now show you something else that happened on that day, busy as it was. And here is a document dated September 22, 1943. It is handwritten by Rabbi Barzilai. It is in French, which, as I mentioned before, was the international language at that time. So it says, the chief rabbi of the Jewish community of Athens certifies that Joseph Lovinger, son of so-and-so, resident of Athens, etc., and married Regina, resident of Athens, etc., according to the regulations of the Jewish religion at the synagogue of Athens on this day, 22nd September 1943, certified by the Grand Rabbi of Athens, Elias Barzilai. So on that fateful day, that's when my parents were married, because of course they realized that's their last chance to get married. There is no community after that. The rabbi is going away. And so there was no ketubah, no ceremony. It was what I imagine was a 3-minute wedding. All right, so what happened next? Well, seeing that there was no list of Jews and that the Jews had escaped all over, the general who was in charge of the SS in Greece issued this order. It was printed in German and in Greek, and it was just plastered all over the streets, as my father told him. Every major street, every major square, government buildings all across Greece. 10 clauses, and it says all Jews in the Greek, in the country of Greece are ordered to return back to their permanent homes. Within 5 days, the Jews need to come to the community office of Athens and register. Jews who do not follow this order will be shot. Non-Jews who shelter Jews are going to be taken to concentration camps unless an even more severe punishment is to be given to them. After the Jews have registered, they're required to appear at the community offices every second day. Jews are not allowed to be out on the streets from 5 p.m. to 7 a.m., etc. So that was the order. It was signed by whom? Look at this name. That name could be familiar to many of you. General Stroop, he was the highest SS and police officer at that time in Greece, and he was notorious for something else. Here he is, something like 5 months earlier, at the Warsaw Ghetto. He was the person who destroyed the Warsaw Ghetto. He was the person who, after the revolt of the Warsaw Jews, eventually burned down every single building or bombed every single building of the Warsaw Ghetto and killed 56,000 people there, not counting the many tens of thousands who were taken away to concentration camps. And he was the one who wrote this famous telegram to Hitler saying there no longer exists a Jewish ghetto in Warsaw. And this was taken, of course, as evidence for the International Military Tribunal in Germany. So for his great work for Hitler in destroying the Warsaw Ghetto, he was rewarded by being sent to warm, sunny, pleasant Greece to be in charge of the SS there. In the end, Stroop was tried and hanged. It took a long time, actually. He was hanged in 1952, if I remember correctly. All right, so a very, very major role in sheltering the Jews of Athens and saving so many of them was played by the Athens police. It was under the chief of police at that time, whose name was Evert, that was his last name. His first name was Angelos, which means angel in Greek, and indeed he was an angel. He gave the order to all police stations to issue false identity cards to all Jews. False identity cards means they were official identity cards, but they showed different names and different religions. So I have one such card here. It says on the front in Greek and German, personal ID. And this card, I'm going to show you on screen as well. This was the police identity card that my mother was able to procure. Shows a different name. Here it is in Greek, here it is in German. Nikolaidou was the last name that was given to her, first name Eleni, and the important information, the life-saving information is right here. Religion, Orthodox Christian. What is amazing is that in none of the police stations, none of the officers, the policemen, ever betrayed any of the Jews to the Germans. They all cooperated and did that, and it was an unbelievable act of personal heroism and humanitarian care for the Jews of Athens. So Police Chief Everett and many others were honored by the Yad Vashem Institute, the Holocaust Memorial Institute of Israel, in 1997 with the distinction of Righteous of the Nations. This was the first group of Greek people honored that way. You see them here on the back row. There's a nun. This is Everett at that time, 1970, many others. The people conducting the ceremony were my father here as president of the Central Board of Jewish Communities, a Greek government minister, a Jewish ambassador, and representative of Yad Vashem. And these honorees indeed were people who deserved not only that title, but the gratitude of all Greek Jews, and were so recognized in Greece as well. I was there at that ceremony. It was in the summer of 1970. I had come back for the summer from vacation. I was a student in New York at Columbia University, and I remember this scene very, very well. All right, that was the story now of the Holocaust in Athens. So I will complete the Holocaust stories with one that really is memorable for a different reason, as you will see. What took place in the island of Zante? So Zante is an island on the western part of Greece, between Italy and Greece. It is famous for its currants. Currants are small raisins. You can buy them in this country too. Zante currants. Okay, so what happened there? Well, as in other parts of Greece, the German general called the local authority, and the local authority was the mayor. Total number of Jewish losses ended up to be 0. All the Jews were protected. This was an ancient community of about 275 people. Even to this day, you see tombstones, graves dating back to the 15th century. So how did those losses actually remain at 0? It was the mayor, and here he is, Mayor Lucas Carrer, and the bishop of the island, Bishop Chrysostomos. So the German general called the mayor and, as all the others, asked for the list of Jews in the island of Zante. Gave him 2 days. The mayor went to the bishop, asked, what should we do? Bishop said, we are going to protect the Jews. We are going to tell all the Jews to escape. We are going to shelter them in churches and monasteries. People are going to take them to their homes. Partisans up in the mountains will play their role. Whoever can be transported away from the island will be done, and it will all be done in those 2 days. And that is what happened. And so after 2 days, the mayor, together with the bishop, came to the German general. And German general asked for the list, and they gave him the list. And when the general opened the list, he saw 2 names, Mayor Carrer, Bishop Chrysostomos. That was the list of the Jews of Zante that they gave him. It was an act of unbelievable heroism. They were recognized by the Central Board of Jewish Communities in Greece after the war with this monument for the bishop and for the mayor. In fact, if you go to the Holocaust Museum right here in Washington, there is a plaque with the story of Bishop Chrysostomos in the island of Zante. All right, so that was the story overall of the Holocaust in Greece, of course, very briefly abbreviated. I will now end it with the role of the Secretary General of the UN. Sorry. Kurt Waldheim. Who was Secretary General of the UN from 1972 to 81. And after that, he ran for president of Austria and won the election and became president for 6 years. So he used to tell the story that during the Second World War, he was a soldier in the Russian front and then later served in the Balkans as an ordinary soldier. But there were rumors that he was recognized, his face was recognized by people in Greece as not a soldier. And so the World Jewish Congress and the Jewish community of Greece investigated. My father was at that time one of the vice presidents of the World Jewish Congress and, of course, president of the Jewish community. They investigated, got interviews, found records. And then one day in 1986, this article appeared in the New York Times and in most newspapers in the world. It got prominent coverage, was on page 3 of the New York Times. Basically, what it reported was that Waldheim, in fact, rather than being just a simple soldier, was an officer in the Balkans and specifically in Salonika. But there is more than that. I will show you some quotes from that article right here. So at the news conference, Joseph Loffinger, president of the Central Jewish Board here, presented documents indicating that Mr. Waldheim, a first lieutenant in the German army in World War II, headed the Department of the Intelligence Section of Army Group E, which was the occupation command for the Balkan Peninsula and which was based in Salonika. So not only was he an officer, he actually headed a department, and that department was not, munitions or supplies. It was the intelligence section. That was where all the orders were coming from Berlin to the army troops in Salonika that would implement the Holocaust, that would round up the Jews and put them on the trains. Mr. Loffinger presented 2 documents addressed to the intelligence unit to which Mr. Waldheim was attached that discussed in specific terms the deportation of Greek Jews. And here is a quote from my father. Now, Waldheim was a diplomat. My father definitely wasn't. My father was outspoken. He wasn't afraid to speak the truth. And so he said, I must call him a liar. He's a miserable liar. So as a result of that, Waldheim was placed in the US watch list and could not enter the US, and eventually became a persona non grata internationally, even though he was at that time the president of Austria. Well, that's the end of the story. So now I'll just show you a few photos from the Jewish communities in Greece today, and we'll end in a minute or two. So this is the Athens synagogue. It's all built of marble, a very beautiful building, outside and inside. There is a Jewish day school in a suburb of Athens. This is the Holocaust Memorial in the Jewish cemetery in Athens. This is the interior of the Athens synagogue. That's the place where I had my bar mitzvah. That's the place where my 2 sons had their bar mitzvahs. That's where I went for the funeral of my father and later on my mother. Here is Thessaloniki, or the old Salonika. There used to be 36 synagogues before the Nazi occupation, 36. All were destroyed. The only one that survived is this one. And the reason it survived was that it was taken over by the Red Cross, which was using it as a storage place. So the Germans left it alone. This is the interior of the synagogue in Salonika. And this is a memorial, a Holocaust memorial that was built at the campus of the University of Thessaloniki, which, as you remember, was essentially the entire campus was the Jewish cemetery of Salonika. Here are some synagogues in other parts of Greece. Ioannina, which is to the northwest of Greece, had a community of about 5,000 Jews before the war, and it was the center of the remaining Romaniot Jews in Greece. It's still an active community, but has only about 50 or 60 people. Alkis is a large island very close to Athens. Volos and Larissa are in central Greece. They have active communities, very small, of course. The island of Rhodes used to have an active community, but now there are no Jews anymore there. And then finally, here are pictures of the two Jewish museums in Greece. The major one is in Athens, and most of the photographs and documents that I showed you came from the Jewish Museum in Greece, and there is one in Salonika as well. So that's the story. Thanks very much for listening. And now I guess we have some time for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Andy, for such a powerful presentation, as personal as well. And I knew from you a little bit about your father, and I'm so glad that you took all these amazing traits from him. Although I haven't seen the trait of speaking out about the government yet. I'm curious about when this trait will come out as well. Thank you so much. It's very powerful as we mark Yom HaShoah here to learn more about both what happened before the Holocaust, the lives that were destroyed, and how we can connect and somehow turn their legacy into ours as well, and learn what happened during the war, and both in preserving the memory and also learning about the Hasidei Umot Olam, the Just Among the Nations, and praising their work, and that really saved many, many, many lives. And we're thankful for everything that they did. Here on Zoom, we have the raise hand button at the very bottom. So if people could use that, it really helps us to know who wants to share or ask something. And I'll follow that role to call people and then ask Andy to answer them. Or if you cannot find that or don't know how to use, just wave like that and you'll find you and a spot for you at some point as well. So we're going to start with Naomi, and then Eva, and then Scott, and then Jean, and then the Bashes.
Thank you so much, Andy. I was wondering when your family left Greece.
Left Greece for what? They never came to the United States, if this is what you're asking.
You were born in Greece?
I was born in Greece.
And when did
right
you
after the war. I grew up there through high school, and then when I was 18 years old, my father sent me to the United States to study. He knew I wanted to be a scientist and a researcher, and he said, "This is the only place for your future." So I came and settled there. I was all alone. My parents lived in Greece, died in Greece.
But later you came back to Greece for army and
Yes.
meet the most important person in your life. Is that correct?
Yes. So right after my master's degree, I had to go back and serve in the Greek military like all Greeks did. Spent almost 3 years doing that in the early 1970s. And that is where I met my wife, Eleanor. And then when I came back for my doctorate, she also joined me and we got married here. That's right.
Eva,
you're muted.
You're still muted. We can't hear you yet.
Okay. Andy, that was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In addition, and thinking about, I think it was Athens you were talking about, maybe it was Salonika. In addition to the mayor and the archbishop, what was the position of the king of Greece with respect to the Jews and the invasion of the Germans?
The king really was out of the picture. In the early days of the German invasion, the whole government sought refuge in Egypt, and this is where they spent the war. So the king was out. The government that followed the German liberation was very favorable to the Jews. One of their first measures was to return properties that they could identify to the Jews, either their survivors or the Central Jewish Organization for the vast majority who had died. But the king was out of the picture.
Interesting.
Thoughts?
So my impression, first of all, thank you for a wonderful presentation. But my impression prior to this this presentation was always that Greece had been a country with tremendous anti-Semitism. So I was rather surprised that all those organizations and people you mentioned wrote out on behalf of the Jews, and that so many leaders took such a strong stand. Any thoughts? Was this uncharacteristic? Was this to what extent was there strong anti-Semitism in Greece before the war? And was this typical or atypical of the way things were?
Yeah, that's a very important question and a difficult one because there isn't a single answer. So I would say, in general, the Greeks were definitely not anti-Semitic. Greeks were very accepting of Jews, especially in the part of Greece where Jews had been Hellenized, where they spoke Greek. And as you saw, they were protected in Athens and other places very, very effectively and broadly. In places like Salonika, that was different. Because first of all, Salonika Jews grew up under Turkish occupation first, before Greece became the country in charge of Salonika, which happened in 1912. So only about 30 years before the Nazis came. So most of the older Salonika Jews did not even speak Greek. They spoke Ladino and Turkish. They did not assimilate. They were a large part of the city and a rich part of the city. They were at the time of the Second World War, they were over 30% of the city's population. So there was a large fraction of the Greek population in Salonika. It was actually not unhappy to see the Jews being taken away to get their properties. They considered them a foreign element. So Salonika was a special case. But I would say the rest of Greece was very supportive of the Jews. During the decades that I grew up, after the end of the war, there were incidents of anti-Semitism occasionally, but I would say they were rare, and they were never violent. It was, people demonstrating, people making threats, people showing anti-Semitic, booklets and things like that. But yeah, so I would say that was the mixed picture of anti-Semitism in Greece over the last century.
Thank you.
Jean, then the Bashes, then Liat, Nida, and Laura Jacobs.
Oh, thanks, Andy. That was just really a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. One of the things I've always been interested in is the different strains of Judaism and communities around the world. So you talked about the Romaniote, Greeks, Jews, the Sephardim, and even Ashkenazim. And I wonder if you would tell us, in your synagogue in Athens, was it a mix of all of those different types of Jews? Or I see your last name Lovinger, it makes me think that perhaps your family was Ashkenazic.
Yes.
And so, and did you have the opportunity to meet and work with or know people who are particularly the Romaniote, since that's such a unusual, rare group of Jews? And what you talked about some of the religious differences, the Torah and stuff, but did you have an opportunity to know some of those people?
Yes, sure. Thanks very much for the question. Yeah, so after the Second World War, which is when I was born, the community was homogeneous. So most by far were Sephardic Jews in Athens, but there were a very significant number of Romaniote Jews. I would say maybe 25% were Romaniote, but they all worshiped together in the one synagogue that I just showed you. That was the one synagogue. Now, there was an older, and there still is, an older synagogue right across the street from the one that I showed you. And that old synagogue was the Romaniote synagogue that is used now only on the high holidays. And I remember when I was a child, we were in the main synagogue to worship, but I used to run across the street to the Romaniote synagogue and go back and forth and see how the services were different. So at that time, there was still a community that sort of showed its identity on the high holidays. The rest of the year, it was all homogeneous. As far as Ashkenazi Jews, you're right. My parents were Ashkenazi Jews. There must have been no more than a dozen of Ashkenazi Jews in Athens, and I knew them all because, well, my parents were friends with them. They had been immigrants from Central Europe. My mother was a refugee from Austria, my father a refugee from Hungary. They left Central Europe, in the 1930s and escaped as far south as they could without imagining that the Nazis would ever come to Greece, but they did. So my parents met in Greece, got married, stayed there, but they were Ashkenazi Jews.
Thank you.
I'll add one question to Jean's question. I learned that in Salonika, especially before the Shabtai Tzvi movement, there is one unique element about those multiple communities coming together, that while we have Sephardic, Ashkenazic synagogues of all flavors, there was only one school that they would come together and the school had to be the same. Do you know if that is something that stayed throughout the centuries as well, Andy?
Yes, I don't know exactly what you mean, but the school that everybody went to before the Second World War was really from the French Educational Association, the Alliance Israélite, which formed schools like that in Jewish communities along the Mediterranean and other parts. So every Jew wanted to be educated there. As far as religious yeshivas, I don't know if there was one or more. However, the synagogues that I mentioned, there were 36 synagogues before. Each one was named after the origin of the people. So there was a Castilian synagogue, there was an Apulian synagogue, there were, synagogues with names from different parts of Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, and they all, in a sense, gravitated to their own.
Thank you, Andy. Rabbi Bash and Deborah have a question.
Trying to unmute myself. I think I'm unmuted now. Deborah is sitting next to me, even though she can't be seen on the screen. And her question you already answered. When were you and Eleanor married, or where were you married? And you answered that question. You were married in the United States, correct?
Yes, that is right. Yes.
Okay. So I have really just additional comments. One is that this past, right before Pesach, two of my granddaughters, one that's studying in Yerushalayim after graduating high school, and one who's on a semester studying in Rome, both went to Greece to visit the Jewish community and to see what was there. And of course, it was a highlight of part of their work during this, before the holiday itself. So they both were very appreciative of what they were able to see and visit. The one that was coming from Jerusalem went down to the sea and came to Greece by boat. That's unique. So my additional comment is that since you mentioned General Stroop, who was the one who was in charge of the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, oversaw the Warsaw Ghetto, I want to say that yesterday there was a dedication of a Warsaw Ghetto Museum, Jewish Warsaw Ghetto Museum that was being opened. Groundbreaking took place yesterday. My sister-in-law, Deborah's sister-in-law, in other words, her brother's wife, was there because her parents were originally from Poland. So she always goes back to Warsaw when there's a special occasion. And she sent us some of the videos of the speeches of the people that made their Polish, really, authorities who were really complimenting the Polish government about the building of a Jewish Warsaw Ghetto Museum. Not a memorial, but a museum to really show what people went through and lived through there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Bash.
Now Liat has a question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andy. I just had a question about like how your parents kind of lived during the German occupation. I know you said they had like new identities, but did they have to hide their Judaism, or how did they kind of get by?
Yes, well, that's another big story that really would be a separate story, which I did not mention because it would take too long. But my parents, of course, had to be hidden, and they were able to escape the Nazis twice and escape from Greece. So my father was arrested by the Nazis despite the ID card, because he was known, was arrested, was able to escape before being taken to Auschwitz. Essentially, he was able to escape because he spoke German. Remember, I mentioned he came from Central Europe, spoke German. The Nazis used him as an interpreter among the Jews who were being gathered to be taken over to the trains that would then take them to Auschwitz. And they used my father to interpret there, and interpret throughout the night. And the next morning, when the German garrison changed, my father kept interpreting, but he had the goal, the chutzpah, to then go to those German officers who came in the morning and didn't know he was a Jew. They just saw him circulating there, talking to the Germans, talking to the Jews. He went and said, "There, you see, I've been working here all night. May I please go out and get a cup of coffee?" Well, they said, "Sure, go, take 15 minutes. So they let him go. He ran away. He then was able to be hidden by Greek neighbors, quite a few of them, because both he and my mother were taken from house to house. Nobody wanted to keep Jews for too long. Eventually, they went through the mountains and ended up in a place where Jews were being helped to go across the Aegean Sea to Turkey. And they were taken by small boats in the middle of the night. Eventually, both my mother and my father were taken over to Turkey, and from there to British Mandate Palestine for a few months until the end of the war, and they returned. So they were hidden, they were helped by Greek Christians, and they were able to survive this way.
Thank you, Andy. Ninera has a question as well. You are muted. You have to unmute first, and then we'll be able to hear you.
Yeah. Dr. Lovinger, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I was born in Greece. I'm a Romagnol Jew.
Wonderful.
My parents, my whole family actually comes from Ioannina.
Yes.
This was a very
center of Romagnol Jewry, yes.
Romagnol community. At the time of the German occupation, my family lived in Agrinio, which is
to the west of Athens, yes.
Not very far from Ioannina. And my family and I were able to survive because we fled the city and we went up to the mountains. And I wanted to point out that during the German occupation, the countryside was, for the most part, free.
Yes.
Greece is a mountainous country, and I want to point out that had the Jews known of the final solution to the Jewish problem, had they known what was happening in other European countries, they would have been able to save themselves. A large number of them would have been able to save themselves because the Greek resistance was very well organized, and my family left only a few days after the Stroop order was issued, with the help of members of the Greek resistance, and we fled to a very tiny, impoverished village in Etolo-Karnania,
Yes.
30 miles outside of Agrinio, where we spent a year until the Germans, until Greece was liberated in October 1944.
Yes.
So we left in September, and we returned a year later. However, almost our entire family in Ioannina perished. And while we were up in the mountains, my father kept sending them letters urging them to leave as well and go to the countryside. And the responses we were getting was that as long as we obey the German regulations and we give them objects of value, furniture, money, and so on, we're fine. Until
Very tragic, yes.
it's too late.
Yes, very tragic.
Masters of deception.
Yeah. Yes,
Masters
thank
of
you for your story. Oh, that's so interesting. And it is typical, I agree with you. The partisans in the mountains helped the Jews a lot. And as you said, they controlled the mountainous countryside, and whoever was able to escape from the cities to the countryside generally was protected. So,
Dr.
Good
Love,
luck.
I have a question for
Yes,
you.
ma'am.
I'm a teacher, and I'm very interested to know whether there are Holocaust studies as part of the curriculum in Greece.
Yes, there certainly is nowadays a mandatory part of modern history that covers the Holocaust. In fact, Greece observes the International Holocaust Days that a number of European and other countries have instituted, which is January 27th. Typically, the president of Greece comes to the ceremony, lays a wreath on the Jewish Holocaust Memorial. There are other events in most cities where Jews lived. And I think the last decade or 15 years, the governments in Greece have really bent over backwards to make sure that the Holocaust story is preserved. And that is different from the experiences that I had when I was young, because at that time, nobody wanted to talk about it.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Jerry has a question.
Trying to unmute.
There you go.
Okay. A few years ago, Laura and I were in Athens, and we wanted to go to the Jewish section, which we did. And as I recall, it was like the Jewish Community Center or whatever, and heavily guarded. So we approached with fear and trembling.
We had a guide.
And we went inside, and we told people in charge who we were and that we were from Arlington, Virginia, and that we had a friend you might have known named Andrew Lovinger. He said, Andreas, oh yes, yes, how is he? And so on. So from then on, we had a very cordial welcome to the community, and afterwards they showed us, I think, a memorial park, which is behind the center or near it.
Right.
So we were pleased to be so well received and on your behalf, Andrew.
I didn't play any role, but I'm glad to hear that I'm still remembered there by some people.
Yes, very much so.
Thank you,
And we
Jay.
got to see the two synagogue buildings,
Okay.
which was wonderful. And it was very special experience for us. And let me add our voices of thank you for tonight as well.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Sylvia.
Yeah. Andy, I'm afraid that my geography knowledge of Greece is not wonderful. So I'm curious as to whether or not all the tales, the experiences you've talked about and what happened during the war, were they all in both parts of Greece? I know there's the northern part and then the Peloponnesus. Are they both all over, or was it just the northern?
No, it was all over. As I mentioned in the beginning, the part that was originally occupied by Germany, which included Salonika and northern Greece, that was unfortunately dealt with very early. And unfortunately, these people didn't know what was coming. The rest of Greece, including Athens, the Peloponnese, southern Greece, at that point, people had already seen what happened in Salonika. And so people were, in a sense, prepared, somewhat like Ms. Ninetta just said. They had heard some stories, and the ones who heeded the danger tried to escape early on. But what I described for Athens was typical of what happened in the rest of Greece. Places like Ioannina, places like central Greece, the Germans rounded up the Jews essentially at the same time as they did the Jews in Athens, which was in March 1944.
And I have one more curiosity question. You said that, was it the cemetery, the ancient cemetery in Salonika that was destroyed and where the university now stands?
Yes.
Were any of the tombstones saved or used for something else?
Oh, yes. And how? And not in a good way. They were looted. So they were used as construction materials. To this day,
Happened elsewhere.
Yeah. Today, you can still see some buildings that have, Jewish tombstones that were used as part of the facade. A few were saved and are in the Jewish Museum of Thessaloniki. But mostly everything was unfortunately used just as construction.
I suppose those that were used for construction, that's sort of a perverse memorial.
Yeah. It's a sad, very sad.
Not the best, of course, but at least it brings an awareness of history.
Yes.
Thank you. I will add my thanks, my great thanks for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Eva has one more question for us.
I'm curious about the 12 Ashkenazi families. Did they speak Yiddish among themselves or at all?
Some did, from what I remember, not all. So some came from parts where they didn't speak Yiddish. Some came from German-speaking parts, and I would say that was the common language. There were some from Germany, some from Hungary. Yiddish, I did not hear much among them. It was mostly Greek and German.
Thank you.
Deborah.
Hi, Andy. That was really fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that. Two questions. Number one, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share the slides. I know a number of people that I think would be very interested in this who were not on tonight, or perhaps you'll write something for the synagogue newsletter or something. But anyway, I'd be very interested in the slides. I know that all of our children, when they were in religious school, and probably still do, have a class on Holocaust studies, and my children to this day remain really interested in Holocaust studies, and this is certainly not a story that they're familiar with. So I think the personal connection to you would make it very meaningful to them.
I'll take on that, Deborah, really quickly, just to share that this is being recorded. It's going to be the entire presentation available next week on YouTube. And right now, we don't have any kids here because we have an event happening in Alexandria at Bethel as a partnership with a couple synagogues of our area. And they're there to listen in firsthand live from one of the survivors who lives here in our area. So they are in an event tonight. The same way that your kids were a couple years ago, that tradition still remains.
No, that's good. That's good. But I'm talking about our children who've long aged out of religious school, but who were still interested and would be interested in seeing this. My other question, though, I wanted to clarify, when your parents each came from Central Europe, did they come as adults, or did they come, like, did their parents bring them? I was just curious about that.
No. Well, thank you for the question. So my father came from Hungary as an adult. He came right after high school. He had the foresight. He said, if Hitler stays in power for 6 months, he'll stay forever, and he'll also come to Hungary. I'm not staying. And he went to Greece, where he had a cousin, and worked there. So he came in the early 30s. My mother lived in Vienna in Austria, so she came after the Anschluss, after the German occupation, the German annexation of Austria in 1938. She was one of 4 sisters, and they each escaped to wherever they could. My mother was able to get a visa to Greece. That's where she went. She had a sister who went to England, another sister who ended up in Brazil, a third sister who went to France. And my mother then went to Greece, and that's where she met my father, and that's how they got married a few years later.
Any last questions or comments from anyone? I just want to thank you so much, our dear Andy, for a wonderful presentation, and I'm really glad that we're able to record this and have that for anyone to access that later. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we have a similar kind of conversation next week about Israel at this very same place and time, 7 p.m. Please take a look at the emails, and I'd love to see all of you there. Thank you so much.